600 bombers, 5,000 crewmen, 24 hours of total strategic failure. The odds were impossible. 16% loss rate in a single afternoon. Military analysts said the daylight bombing campaign was dead. The physics of modern warfare had hit a wall, until one man decided to ignore the blueprints. They called it a suicide mission. The engineers back in the States said the physics didn't add up. But in the smoke-filled hangars of 1943, one man with a length of wire and a radical theory was about to prove them all wrong. This isn't just a story of a modification. It is the story of how a backyard invention bypassed the military-industrial complex to save thousands of lives. To understand the gravity of this, you have to look at the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. It was a massacre. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed in the combat box. The idea that enough B-17s could create a wall of lead. They were wrong. The Luftwaffe had found the blind spots. They targeted the nose, shredding crews before they could even aim. If you flew 25 missions, your statistical chance of survival was 0. The industrial solution was months away, but the crews in the field, they had hours. Our protagonist, a field tinkerer, realized the factory standard wiring caused a lag in the gunnery sights. A fraction of a second, that's all the Luftwaffe needed. The military command ordered him to stop. They said his math was amateur. But here is what nobody knew at the time. The blueprints they were following were fundamentally flawed. While the high-ranking brass sat in heated offices in Washington, the hangars in East Anglia were freezing. Our tinkerer, let's call him the ghost engineer, didn't have a laboratory. He had a crate of salvaged parts from crashed planes. The problem was the lead. In aerial combat, you don't fire where the enemy is. You fire where they will be. The computing sites of 1943 were mechanical marvels, but they were slow. By the time the gears turned, the Focke-Wulf 190 had already zipped through the kill zone. The ghost engineer's theory bypassed the mechanical lag using a primitive electrical overclock. He wanted to use a specific length of wire to create a low-voltage shunt that would snap the reticle into place instantly. But there was a catch. The piece of Entine's electrical system was already redlined. Adding this backyard shunt risked an electrical fire at 30,000 feet. When he brought this to the Boeing inspectors, they were horrified. They threatened him with a court-martial. They told him he was turning a multi-million-dollar bomber into a flying tinderbox. He did it anyway. Under the cover of darkness, he and a small group of loyal mechanics began the midnight retrofit. They weren't just modifying a plane. They were committing an act of technical treason. October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday. The ghost engineer had managed to retrofit exactly one aircraft, a B-17 nicknamed the Defiant. The pilot knew the mod was illegal. He knew if the wings caught fire, no parachute would save him from the Brassus Rethif. The German flak didn't get him first. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin and the temperature is minus 40 degrees. The grease in the guns freezes. The nerves of the men shatter. Suddenly, the cry comes over the intercom. Bandits at 12 o'clock high. This was it. The Luftwaffe used their head-on tactic. They dove straight at the nose of the Defiant. Ordinarily, the nose gunner would struggle with the mechanical lag of the sight. But today, he flipped the illegal switch. The reticle didn't drift. It jumped. It was like the gun was reading his mind. For the first time, the impossible physics of the backyard engineer met the reality of the German steel. In a 3-second burst, the lead Focke-Wulf didn't just smoke it. Disintegrated. By the time the mission was over, the Defiant had confirmed 4 kills, triple the average. But as they landed, the inspectors were waiting on the tarmac. They had seen the unauthorized wires hanging from the fuselage. The ghost engineer was grounded. His wire was ripped out and sent to a lab for analysis. The official report called it reckless disregard for standardized equipment. They were going to bury him. But then, the data came back from the gunnery cameras, while the rest of the fleet had a 5% accuracy rating. The Defiant was hitting at nearly 25%. The backyard invention wasn't just a fluke. it was a revelation. The military-industrial complex did what it always does. It took his idea, refined it, put a serial number on it, and claimed it as their own. By 1944, every bomber coming off the line had a variation of that illegal length of wire. The man who invented it, he didn't get a medal. He didn't get a royalty check. He went back to his hangar, picked up his soldering iron, and looked for the next impossible problem to solve. Today, we take computerized fire control for granted. We trust the software, but we forget that the foundation of modern aerial combat wasn't built in a Silicon Valley boardroom. It was built by a guy with a wire, a theory, and the courage to tell the experts they were wrong. The next time someone tells you the physics don't add up, remember the smoke-filled hangars of 1943. Sometimes, the only way to save the world is to break the rules. But on June 4th, 1942, everything changed forever. The horizon blurred into a haze of smoke and salt spray. The systems we relied on were screaming toward failure. The manuals were useless. The physics were breaking. The critical situation required action that no one dared take. Our primary interceptors were grounded by a recurring glitch. The fleet was sitting ducks, exposed to an incoming strike. Every expert at the Pentagon had already predicted our failure. What happened in the next 72 hours would change history. It would completely rewrite the laws of modern aerial combat. Because this pilot didn't just survive the impossible odds, he achieved something that the engineers said was a fantasy, and the method he used to win that day. It remains a mystery element tucked away in classified files. It wasn't a new engine or a faster wing design. It was a ghost in the machine, hidden in plain sight. The enemy fleet was 3 times the size of our own. Their pilots were veterans of 1,000 successful sorties. We were outmanned, outgunned, and technically crippled. The odds of a successful defense were near zero. In the corner of Hangar B, a different war was starting. While the brass debated retreat, one man grabbed a toolkit. He knew the lead computing site was the heart of the problem. If he couldn't fix the site, he couldn't hit the target. The standard wiring was a nightmare of short. Salt air had corroded the silver contacts within the computer. The wire solution was born out of pure desperation. It was a bypass that ignored every safety protocol. He began weaving a makeshift circuit through the floor. It bypassed the faulty primary bus and drew power directly. It was crude, ugly, and smelled of burning insulation, but it gave the pilot direct control over the firing solenoid. He was essentially hot-wiring a 10-ton weapon of war. The modification created a manual override for the sight. If his timing was off by a fraction, the guns would jam. But if it worked, he'd have the first smart gun. By dawn, the modification was complete but untested. The ground crew refused to sign off on the flight safety. They called it a suicide rig, a ticking time bomb. The hero just climbed into the cockpit and closed the canopy. The radial engine roared, shaking the entire airframe. He pulls back on the stick, feeling the weight of the change. The airframe groans under the weight of the modification. The plane feels heavier, angrier, like it's fighting back. As the wheels left the deck, the tension was suffocating. If the wire snaps now, the flaps lock instantly. The aircraft would flip and become a multi-ton steel coffin. He was flying a prototype that shouldn't legally exist. At 5,000 feet, the first warning lights flickered. The makeshift wiring was vibrating against the fuel lines. The pilot could feel the heat radiating from the floor. Every nerve in his body told him to turn back now. The next 60 seconds would change the fate of the mission. He reached for the switch that activated the wire solution. The moment he flipped it, the cockpit lights dimmed. The engine surged as the electrical load shifted violently. Then, the radarman's voice crackled through the static. 3 bogies, high at 12 o'clock. Closing fast. This wasn't a drill or a calibration flight anymore. This was the first Q's result of a desperate gamble. The enemy was flying the legendary Type 0 fighters. They were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than him. Usually, the rules say you never turn with them. But with the modification, the rules were about to break. The enemy pilot brakes left, expecting a standard pursuit. He's used to outturning every opponent he's ever faced. But our hero doesn't follow the traditional arc of flight. He uses the modification to override the gunly lag. Wait until you see what happens next in the dogfight. The enemy realizes the rules of engagement have changed. The tracers aren't falling behind him like they usually do. They are leading him perfectly, as if guided by a ghost. The first burst of fire was surgical and devastating. The enemy fighter disintegrated in a cloud of magnesium. It was a kill that should have been mathematically impossible. The modification had turned a pilot into a precision sniper. The first kill was a shock to both sides of the war. The enemy wingman pulled into a vertical climb to escape. Under normal conditions, our hero would have lost the track, but the wire solution was still feeding the data. He pulled the stick back until his vision began to blur. The unauthorized wire was humming with a high-pitched whine. It was drawing so much power, the radio began to hiss. He was flying a weapon that was eating itself. More enemy fighters dropped from the sun to join the fray. The sky was becoming a chaotic web of smoke and steel. The hero was now outnumbered 4-1 in the clouds. Every expert prediction of failure was starting to look true. The enemy couldn't understand the geometry of the attack. They were pulling maneuvers that should have been invisible, but the modified sight tracked them through every roll. The mystery element was proving to be a game changer. A second enemy aircraft plummeted toward the waves. The remaining pilots broke formation in a fit of panic. They had never seen a heavy fighter move like this. The rules of the air were being rewritten in real time, but the modification was pushing the hardware too far. The internal temperature of the site was reaching a limit. Acrid smoke began to fill the small, cramped cockpit. The hero had to choose. Kill the power or keep the fight. He chose to push forward, despite the growing danger. The third enemy pilot was an ace, weaving with expert skill. This was the duel that would decide the fate of the fleet. The wire under the floorboard began to glow orange. They were locked in a deadly dance of kinetic energy. Neither pilot could gain the advantage for several minutes. The wire solution was the only thing keeping him alive. One slip in concentration would mean a high-speed collision. Suddenly, the amber glow of the sight began to stutter. The insulation on the bypass wire was finally melting away. The hero slapped the instrument panel in frustration. He needed just 10 more seconds of clear targeting data. The hunter was about to become the hunted in this sky. The enemy ace saw the smoke trailing from the plane. A banked hard, bringing his cannons to bear on the tail. The expert's prediction of failure was seconds away. In a move of desperation, he flipped the master switch. He sent a final surge of power through the illegal circuit. The cockpit light exploded in a shower of white sparks. The sight froze into a fixed position at the perfect angle. The hero squeezed the trigger one last time that day. A stream of bullets tore through the enemy's engine. The ace's plane stalled and began its long, vertical fall. The modification had held together just long enough. The sky suddenly went quiet as the remaining enemies fled. They had seen enough of this ghost and its impossible aim, but the hero's victory was overshadowed by a new crisis. His cockpit was now an inferno of electrical fire. He fought the flames while trying to maintain altitude. The wire solution had burned out, taking the radio with it. He was blind, deaf, and flying a crippled, smoking wreck. The carrier was still 50 miles away across the water. Fuel was low, and the engine was coughing rhythmically. Every mile felt like an eternity in that battered cockpit. He looked down at the charred remains of his modification. It was a piece of junk now, but it had saved the world. The salt spray was hitting the underside of the wings. He was flying too low for safety, but had no choice. The engine didn't have the compression left to climb. He was walking a tightrope between the sky and the sea. The silence of a dead engine is a pilot's nightmare. He leaned the mixture out to the absolute ragged edge. Every drop of fuel was a precious second of life. The carrier was still nowhere to be seen on the horizon. His nerves were shot after the intensity of combat. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold fatigue. He kept seeing the enemy ace's face in his mind. He wondered if anyone would believe his story if he lived it. Then, a tiny gray sliver appeared against the blue water. It was the carrier, but it was heading away from him. He had no radio to tell them he was coming in hot. He had no signal flares left in his emergency kit. On the deck, They saw a plane trailing black smoke. They didn't know if it was friend or a kamikaze attacker. The anti-aircraft guns began to swivel toward the craft. The hero was about to be shot down by his own side. He rocked the wings. The international signal of a friend. The gunners on the deck hesitated, fingers on triggers. They recognized the silhouette of the battered fighter. The order to hold fire echoed across the ship. The landing deck was a moving target in the rough seas. Without his flaps working, his landing speed was too high. He was coming in like a scorched meteor toward the wires. One mistake would turn the deck into a furnace. The hook dangled, searching for a cable to grab. The pilot cut the engine just as he cleared the stern. The world went silent for a heartbeat as he drifted. The wire solution had one final task: keep him level. Metal shrieked against metal as the tires blew out. The arrestor cable snapped, taut, groaning under the strain. The plane jerked to a violent halt, spinning 40 degrees. He was down, but the aircraft was a total loss. White foam covered the scorched wings and canopy. They pried the glass open to pull the hero from the heat. He emerged coughing, clutching a piece of charred copper. He refused to let go of the evidence of his modification. The Admiral stood in silence, looking at the bullet holes. He looked at the melted floorboards and exposed wires. This was the man who had predicted the mission's failure. He looked the pilot in the eye and saw a different man. The wire solution was now just a lump of slagged metal. To the untrained eye, it looked like a catastrophic failure. But the camera film from the guns told a different story. It showed a precision that shouldn't exist in 1942. WWII's intelligence officers arrived on deck. They quarantined the plane and covered it with a tarp. No one was allowed to speak about what had happened. The mystery element was officially being taken underground. They asked how he calculated the lead on targets. He told them he didn't calculate. Wire did it for him. They called him a liar. Then they called him a genius. Then they told him he could never fly with it again. The report was filed under a code name, Ghost Lead. It was deemed too dangerous for general distribution. The experts feared the modification was too unstable. They chose to bury the breakthrough to protect the status quo. The war ended, and the hero returned to civilian life. He never spoke of the day he rewrote the rules of flight. The plane was scrapped, and the hangar was demolished. The story of the modification became an urban legend. Fast forward 80 years to a researcher in Virginia. He found a set of handwritten notes in a mislabeled box. They described a manual lead computing bypass circuit. The math on the page didn't match the technology of the era. The researcher realized he was looking at a primitive AI. It was an analog precursor to modern targeting computers. It used engine RPM to calculate the projectiles drop. It was 80 years ahead of its time, hidden in a wreck. Today's pilots rely on millions of lines of code. They see the world through sensors and digital overlays. But at the core of their systems is a simple logic. It's the same logic found in that charred piece of copper. The mystery element wasn't just a physical component. It was a shift in how humans interact with machines. It was the moment we stopped flying the plane alone, and we started letting the machine assist our survival. Modern simulations show the expert predictions were right. Without the modification, the hero dies in 99% of cases. The wire solution was the only variable that changed it. It was a statistical anomaly created by a man with a wrench. He lived a quiet life, but he kept one secret close. He knew that the machines we build are only the beginning. The real power lies in the modifications we make in the dark. True innovation happens when the manual is thrown away. Every engineer today is taught to respect the field, but they are also taught to look for the unauthorized path. The ghost of the wire solution lives in every cockpit. It is the reminder that the human spirit is the ultimate mod. We look at history as a series of planned events. We think the best technology always wins the day, but history is actually made by the desperate and brave. It is made by the people who refuse to accept failure. The next time you are told something is impossible, remember the pilot, the wire, and the day the sky burned. Remember that the rules are only as strong as your will, because sometimes the mystery element is simply you. By 1947, the wire solution was no longer a fix. Secret labs began reverse engineering the hero's wiring. They realized the lead computing math was flawless. The chaos of the cockpit had birthed a new era. The experts who predicted failure were forced to apologize. In private memos, they admitted the pilot found a shortcut. He had bypassed 5 tons of hardware with 6 inches of wire. It was the first time software outperformed hardware in combat. When the next conflict began, the secret was deployed. The F-86 Sabre jets carried a box labeled Targeting Assist. Inside was a refined version of that original illegal circuit. The Ghost was now a standard feature in the arsenal, but the military kept the origin story buried deep. They didn't want pilots thinking they could modify their jets. They wanted the credit to go to the industrial complex. The hero's name was scrubbed from the patent filings. The pilot lived out his days as a simple flight instructor. He watched the world transition from propellers to jet engines. Every time he saw a new plane, he looked at the floor. He was looking for the wires the engineers didn't want.
Look closely at this simple piece of wire. It looks like scrap from a garage floor. But in 1943, this was a lethal weapon. A weapon that the experts said was impossible. It would save thousands of lives by sunset. This is the secret of the wire solution. 2,000 extra miles, achieved by the end. The tactic? Still taught at West Point today. The moment the hero finally figured it out. It happens at minute 14 of our story. It is a moment of absolute technical brilliance. Stay tuned to see how they changed history. Our story begins in the winter of 1943. The Allied bombing campaign was hitting a wall. The bomber mafia had made a huge mistake. They thought bombers didn't need any protection. The German Luftwaffe was proving them wrong. Every mission was becoming a suicide run. If you were a pilot, you were terrified. The math of survival was leaning toward zero. The German fighters were faster and deadlier, and our escort planes had to turn back early. They simply didn't have the fuel to stay. The border of Germany was a total death trap. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a massive beast. 7 tons of steel and 2,000 horsepower. It was designed to be a high-altitude king, but it had one fatal, glaring weakness. It drank fuel faster than it could carry it. It was tethered to the coast of France. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group knew. They watched their friends vanish over the horizon. They needed to go deeper into German airspace, but the external fuel tanks were failing them. The factory-made release systems were breaking. The Jug was a giant without any legs. At high speeds, the vibration was violent. The standard factory pins would simply snap off. Tanks would fall off over the English Channel, or worse, they would refuse to drop at all. A hung tank turned a fighter into a target. Aerodynamics was winning the war against us. General Spot's demand.
Once the wire solution was implemented, allowing the P-47 to carry massive 200-gallon belly tanks without them vibrating loose or failing to release, the math of the war changed overnight. Before the modification, a P-47's radius was a measly 230 miles. They were tethered to the coast of France, but with the field-expedient wiring fixed to the fuel release shackles, that radius jumped to over 400 miles. Suddenly, the Jug wasn't just a harbor guard. It was a deep penetration predator. The kill count. In the 3 months following the wire solution rollout, the 8th Air Force saw a 35% increase in air-to-air victories. Why? Because they finally had the fuel to stay and fight. Pilots like Gabby Gabreski and Robert Johnson weren't just better flyers. They had better reach. When the impossible wire solution reached the top brass, the reaction wasn't what you'd expect. Initially, the stateside engineers at Republic Aviation were insulted. They had spent millions on perfect aerodynamic releases, only for a group of grease-stained mechanics in a muddy hangar in England to fix it with a few cents worth of copper wire and a clever loop-back system. However, General Curtis LeMaya Mann, known for his brutal pragmatism, didn't care about hurt feelings. He saw the mission success rates and ordered the modification to be standard issue. By late 1943, the field fix was being integrated directly into the assembly lines in Evansville and Farmingdale. It was a rare moment in military history where the top-down hierarchy was flipped on its head by bottom-up genius. This isn't just a story about old planes. The 1943 wire solution is the direct ancestor of modern field expedient engineering. Today, we see this in the MacGyvering of drones in Ukraine or soldiers. 3D printing replacement parts for armored vehicles in combat zones. The principle remains ID.